Um, so, I mean, a lot of there's a lot of questions that I'm kind of like, I wonder what Suzanne would say. Like, so here's a question along those lines. And if you don't know these things, just you could just say you don't know it. But when I went there and I volunteered, they said Cuomo has suspended. There can be no malpractice for this period of time during the disaster where they were calling for volunteers to come in. And then as I was going to the end, kind of the chief medical officer was going around. He's saying, "Hey, things are going back to normal." Not like, "Oh, quit screwing around," but it's like, no, now we need to be extra careful and with documentation and whatever to kind of things go back to the normal kind of medical legal heightened fears and whatever. I'm curious, like, what's the legal basis for being able to suspend malpractice? How does that play out? And
So I did talk to a friend, Josh Bloom, who's a New York attorney, and I wanted to confer with him about your question regarding Cuomo's order. And from my understanding, well, first of all, the state, your program must have given you permission to practice outside of California. And assuming we're in the middle of a pandemic, then I'm not sure if you're in New York. I thought you were
so
California.
I don't, yeah, I didn't have I only have a California license. I don't
Right,
have a New York license. They did kind of emergency
right,
privileges and they verified
right.
my license in California, and that was good enough for this.
Okay, so that's the first thing. And then now, let's say a patient died and they have a clever plaintiff's lawyer who is going to be going after, for sure, the hospital, and then anybody else they can tack on. So that'd be the individual doctor.
Right.
And so the defense would be, because I saw the order, it doesn't mean they can't sue you. You would have immunity if you were within this 30-day period of practicing and you exercised only negligence, not gross negligence, which is much more egregious conduct. So
Really
that
bad. Doing
terrible.
something really bad.
Yes, the law school example is like leaving a surgical tool inside the patient or operating on the wrong arm, something like that.
Right.
So um, now that clever plaintiff's lawyer is going to say it was gross negligence. They're going to make that argument. So they're going to try to get around that, and it doesn't just completely insulate you from liability. It's just your defense, and it should be hopefully handled by the hospital's insurance or your own.
Yeah.
You may get into a big thing. I didn't see your contract that you signed. This is
Yeah.
something that I would have negotiated. I would have made sure there's insurance coverage that's either, my client has it, the extension to go to another state to practice, which I think it'd be better for that hospital to include you in the coverage, obviously.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Right.
Um, so let me ask you just a little more about this because this came up was and I talked to this ICU doctor in New York, and we were talking a lot about end of life decisions. Sometimes families want everything done, which could mean leaving somebody on a ventilator for a long time who really isn't going to have any chance at meaningful recovery, versus um, an ICU doctor, for example, who doesn't want to do CPR as a patient is dying because it's medically futile. It's not going to make a difference. The patient's going to die anyway. So you have this dilemma on the one hand between kind of medical futility and a doctor saying, no, this really isn't medically necessary or beneficial, versus the patient's kind of stated wishes or the wishes of the durable power of attorney, the family member that makes that decision. I saw a lot of the tension with that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that particular dilemma.
So most of my clients have small medical practices. Most of my clients are small businesses. They're not hospitals. I would think that the hospital policies would have to outline what goes on in that situation. And the protocol would need to be followed, because otherwise you've got the wrongful death actions, which again, I'm not a part of. I've heard of them going on, and I've already heard of them going on. People contacted me. I've referred them to lawyers to handle that. It's not my area. So,
Wrongful death meaning what?
well, the negligence of the hospital or the facility or doctor in terms of handling the patient. So this person did not pass away of natural causes. They passed away because there was a failure on some part of the medical care.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting, I mean, we had some kind of conversations about it. The defense of medical futility, it's a dilemma. I mean, you never want to abandon the patient or their wishes, but then on the other side, you don't want to torture them at the end of their life either for something that isn't going to help them to live longer or recover.
Yeah, they're going to look at the standard of care. You know, what's the proper standard of care? Was that followed?
Well, and then the standard of care too, in the middle of a pandemic
Mm-hmm.
where so many people are dying, and you don't. I mean, how does the hospital's capacity change that? I mean, I'll give you an example. We had a patient who um, was kind of full code, do everything, and they suddenly got worse from a respiratory standpoint. We had to put them on a ventilator, and then she stabilized, and the patient was unable to go to the ICU because the ICU was full. And so they got care on the floor by a nurse who was doing her best, and I think she was doing a great job, but wasn't an ICU nurse. Didn't have all of the, you know, monitors and buttons and experience. And so it's like, what do you do in that circumstance where the capacity of the hospital is maxed out? How does that factor in a potential lawsuit, you know?
This is something that they would tender to their insurance, which is important for me to bring up because that's been also occurring right now. Is do companies have proper insurance for coronavirus issues that are? I mean, there's going to be so much litigation. The courts are just going to be so flooded, and so having whether you have business interruption insurance or even, we're in LA, so entertainment industry, production insurance for coronavirus issues. There's an outbreak. So yeah, it's a good time to look at your insurance policies, make sure that you have good CGL, commercial general liability. There's, officers and directors policies, D&O, for, maybe they're making bad decisions with regards to increasing the budget to provide more personal protective equipment, and more staff. If they're going to look at all of these things. And so it's going to be pretty messy with litigation and increasing insurance policies probably.